They laughed at her torn pink dress, until the Millionaire CEO walked onto the dance floor and changed everything. The school auditorium was alive with the smells of floor polish and the faint sweetness of tangerines, the kind of scent that lingered from the morning when parents had helped set up for the dance. Paper garlands hung unevenly along the walls, swaying slightly each time the heavy doors opened, and a DJ in the corner tapped nervously at his playlist, trying to time each song just right. Groups of first graders clustered around the long refreshment table, chattering loudly as they grabbed cups of juice and cookies, while others giggled near the stage, their voices mixing with the faint hum of anticipation in the air. Against the far wall, away from the swirl of movement and laughter, stood 6-year-old Sophie Carter, her hands clinging to the frayed hem of her pink dress. Once, the dress might have been considered special, with its simple lines and gentle folds, but now it was faded from countless washes, dotted with tiny holes near the seams, and marred by a stubborn stain on the collar that no soap could remove. Her blonde hair was tied neatly into a bun that her mother had fixed earlier that day with careful hands, though her mother's strength had been limited. Sophie's large blue eyes held a quiet determination. She had promised herself she would not cry tonight, no matter what. Around her, whispers floated just loud enough for her to hear. A group of children cast glances in her direction before turning away in exaggerated disinterest, their words coated with cruelty that they didn't yet understand could wound deeply. "I'm not dancing with her," one boy muttered with a smirk, "that dress looks like it came from the trash." The word stung, though Sophie kept her posture still, as if her stillness could make her invisible. She pressed her small palms against her chest, as though holding her heart in place could keep the tears from coming. Her mind wandered briefly to home, to the small bedroom she shared with her mother, to the gentle voice that used to read her bedtime stories every night before illness had taken hold. Her mother, Megan, had done everything she could to make this evening special, braiding her hair in the morning, fastening the bun with a ribbon, smoothing the wrinkles from the only dress they had for such occasions, but she could not be here tonight. Megan had been too unwell to leave bed for more than a few minutes at a time, and there had been no money for something new to wear. Sophie told herself the dress was fine, that it didn't matter, but the echo of laughter from nearby tables told her the world didn't agree. The double doors at the back of the hall opened again, letting in a burst of cool evening air. A group of adults entered, school patrons and guests, dressed in suits and elegant dresses, their shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. Among them was a tall man whose presence seemed to command the room without him trying. His light blue suit contrasted with the deep brown of his neatly styled hair, and his clear blue eyes scanned the hall with calm assurance. He greeted the principal with a polite nod, but as he turned his head, his gaze stopped on Sophie. In the swirl of music, laughter, and restless shuffling, there was a momentary stillness, as though the hum of the room had shifted. Sophie noticed the look, though she didn't yet understand why it felt different from the glances she had grown used to. The man's expression held neither pity nor curiosity, it was something else entirely, something she couldn't name but that made her stand a little straighter without realizing it. Michael Reed had attended dozens of school events in his life as part of his company's community outreach programs, but he had never felt compelled to change course in the middle of a conversation the way he did now. As the principal continued to thank him for the foundation's recent grant, his mind was no longer on the rehearsed pleasantries or the expected remarks about the importance of education. His attention was fixed entirely on the little girl standing alone near the far wall, her small frame wrapped in a faded pink dress that seemed to hold more history than fabric. There was a stillness about her, not the relaxed kind but the kind born from trying to become invisible. He had seen similar postures before, in boardrooms when junior staff tried not to be noticed, in shelters where children waited for their turn in line. Yet here, at what was supposed to be a joyful event, that quiet attempt to vanish felt especially out of place. He excused himself from the principal with a polite smile, moving through the crowd with the ease of someone who was used to commanding a room, though his purpose was different tonight. A few children noticed him passing and stared at the light blue suit and polished shoes, some whispering to one another, but he paid them no mind. When he reached Sophie, he slowed his pace, lowering his posture slightly so that he wouldn't tower over her. Up close, the details of the dress became clearer, the frayed edges near the cuffs, the small hand-sewn repairs at the hem, the stain near the collar that had resisted every attempt to hide it. He also saw the way her fingers gripped the fabric, knuckles pale from the pressure, as though holding on to the dress itself was her only anchor. "May I have this dance?" His voice was calm, almost casual, but his eyes held a quiet insistence that made it impossible to dismiss the invitation as politeness. Sophie's head lifted, her blue eyes locking onto his with an expression that was equal parts confusion and disbelief. Around them, the laughter that had filled the room moments earlier faltered. A boy near the refreshment table muttered something to his friend, who stifled a laugh, but neither of them dared speak louder. Michael extended his hand without glancing away from her, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged, as if this simple act had unsettled an unspoken rule. Sophie hesitated, glancing toward the group of classmates who were now watching openly. She seemed to weigh something in her mind before finally releasing the hem of her dress and placing her small hand into his. Her palm was warm but slightly trembling, the way a bird's might feel when caught and held too gently to struggle. Michael led her toward the center of the floor, where the DJ, clearly uncertain of what was happening, fumbled with the playlist before letting the current waltz continue to play. As they began to move, Michael kept his steps slow and measured, adjusting his stride so that Sophie didn't have to strain to match him. At first, she kept her gaze lowered, watching her feet as though afraid of misstepping, but gradually she glanced up, curiosity softening the tightness in her expression. Her bun swayed slightly as they turned, and the skirt of her dress, though thin, caught a ripple of movement that made it seem momentarily lighter, as if the years worn into its fabric didn't matter. Around them, whispers shifted in tone. Some of the children's faces showed confusion, others a dawning awareness that this was not the kind of moment they could make fun of without looking foolish. By the time the song ended, Sophie's grip on his hand had eased. Michael gave a small bow, and she returned it with the faintest hint of a smile, small enough to miss if you weren't looking for it, but to him, it was the most important change in the room. He escorted her back to her seat near the wall, but instead of leaving immediately, he pulled a chair beside hers and sat down. The noise of the dance resumed around them, but a subtle shift had taken place. Those who had laughed earlier now kept their distance, uncertain of how to resume their mockery without it feeling out of place. Sophie sat a little straighter, not because her dress had changed or because the room was suddenly kinder, but because someone had chosen to stand, no, dance, beside her when no one else would. Michael didn't leave her side right away. Instead, he leaned slightly forward in his chair so their voices could be heard over the music without forcing Sophie to speak too loudly. He asked her simple questions at first, whether she liked school, if she enjoyed dancing, and what she usually did for fun. Her answers were short and cautious, as though she was measuring how much she could safely reveal to someone she had just met. Gradually, however, her words became a little more open. She told him that her favorite subject was art because she could make something out of nothing, and that she liked dancing even though she didn't get much chance to do it. She spoke about her mother in a way that mixed pride with worry, describing how kind she was and how she always tried to smile even when she was tired. When Michael mentioned the dress, complimenting how carefully it had been kept, Sophie looked down and ran her fingers along the hem. She explained that it was her mother's favorite, even though they had found it in a second-hand shop a long time ago. It was special because her mother had told her it was beautiful no matter what other people said. As she smoothed the skirt, Michael's eyes caught something unusual on the inside of the fabric where the hem folded. There, almost hidden, were tiny embroidered shapes, small birds stitched with such precision and individuality that he knew instantly they hadn't been made by a factory machine. Each one was slightly different from the other, the kind of handwork that carried both skill and affection. A sudden wave of recognition hit him. These birds were exactly like the ones his late sister, Grace, used to sew into the clothes she made for children in their neighborhood when they were younger. Grace had called them her lucky birds, saying they were meant to remind anyone who wore them that they had wings, even if they couldn't see them yet. Michael remembered sitting at the kitchen table as a teenager, watching her work by the soft glow of the lamp, her fingers moving quickly while she told him stories about the children she was sewing for. It had been years since he'd thought about those evenings, but now it was as if the years between had collapsed into this one moment. "May I take a closer look at the seam?" he asked, his voice careful not to startle her. Sophie nodded and gently lifted the edge of the dress so he could see. He turned the fabric over and found, next to one of the birds, faint embroidered initials, "Gr." The stitches were worn and faded, but they were unmistakable. He felt a tightening in his chest, a realization forming that connected his past to this child in a way he hadn't anticipated. Grace R., his sister's name, Grace Reed. This dress had once passed through his sister's hands, carrying her mark, her care, and now it belonged to this little girl sitting quietly beside him in a room full of people who had ignored her until moments ago. Michael didn't say anything right away. He didn't want to overwhelm her with the story of how he knew the dress, nor did he want to make the moment about his own memories. But something in him shifted as he sat there, watching Sophie's small hands fold the skirt back into place. This wasn't just a chance meeting at a school dance anymore. The fact that she wore something touched by his sister's kindness felt like a thread pulling him toward a responsibility he hadn't been looking for but could no longer ignore. He knew then that whatever this connection meant, it was not something he could walk away from. The following afternoon Michael found himself standing in front of a modest 3-story apartment building on the quieter side of town. It was the kind of place where the paint on the railings had long since begun to peel and the mailboxes carried layers of tape from years of quick repairs. He hadn't announced his visit in advance, part of him worried that if he gave himself too much time to think, he might overcomplicate something that needed to be simple. He climbed the narrow stairwell, the scent of cooking mixed faintly with the medicinal sharpness of antiseptic lingering in the air, until he reached the door with the number Sophie had quietly told him the night before. When Megan Carter opened the door, she looked smaller than he expected. Her frame was delicate, almost fragile, her face pale in a way that suggested more than just fatigue, but her eyes, clear and light like Sophie's, held a guarded warmth. She hesitated when she saw him, her hand tightening on the edge of the door, clearly unsure why a man in a tailored light blue suit was standing in her hallway. Sophie's voice floated from somewhere inside, calling out to ask who was there. Megan stepped aside cautiously, and Michael entered, finding himself in a small but tidy living room where every object seemed to have a purpose. Sophie appeared a moment later, her hair loose now and falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She was holding the pink dress draped over her arms like a precious relic. "I wanted to show him the birdies," she told her mother with the kind of earnestness only a child could have. Megan glanced at the dress and then at Michael, a flicker of confusion crossing her face as she tried to make sense of his interest. They all sat down, and over the next several minutes Megan explained, with quiet matter-of-factness, how she had found the dress in a box of heavily discounted clothes at a thrift store. She said she hadn't noticed the embroidery until later, and by then the dress had already become Sophie's favorite. It didn't take long for Michael to hear what wasn't being said. Megan spoke about her illness in understated terms, avoiding details, but the signs were everywhere: the careful way she shifted in her seat to avoid strain, the thinness in her wrists, the faint shadows beneath her eyes. There was no self-pity in her voice, only the plain reality of trying to keep life steady for her daughter when so much of it rested on fragile foundations. She admitted she hadn't been able to work much lately and that bills piled up faster than she could manage. She said it all without complaint, as if rehearsed from having to explain it before, but Michael could feel the weight behind her words. When he told her about Grace, the sister who used to sew little bird stitches into clothes for children who couldn't afford new ones, something shifted in the room. Megan's expression softened into a smile tinged with surprise, as though a tiny light had been switched on in a dim corner. She ran her fingers lightly over the hem of the dress, tracing one of the stitches. "Then it's even more special than I thought," she said quietly, almost to herself. Sophie leaned against her mother's side, listening but not fully grasping the history they were speaking of, only sensing that it meant the dress had a story beyond her own. Michael stayed longer than he had planned. He asked Megan about Sophie's school, her interests, her friends, and each answer painted a clearer picture of the girl who had stood so still against the wall the night before. By the time he left, the sun was low, casting a warm, amber light through the narrow hallway. As he stepped outside, he realized that meeting Sophie had stirred something more personal than the charity events and sponsorships his company often managed. This wasn't about writing a check or funding a program from a distance. This was about a specific child, a specific family, and a shared thread from his past that tied him directly to them. The decision formed in his mind as naturally as breathing. He was going to help them, and not just once, but in a way that would change the course they were on. Michael began his plans the very next morning, sitting at his kitchen table long before the city had fully awakened. The early light cast pale blue streaks across the papers spread before him, each page carrying a sketch of an idea, a name of someone who could help, or a note about resources his foundation already had in place. He had built his career on structuring large-scale projects, but this felt different. This was intimate, direct, and required a kind of precision that went beyond budgets and timelines. He kept thinking of Sophie in that dress, of the way she had straightened her back when he asked her to dance, and of Megan's quiet resilience. The connection to Grace's stitching wasn't just sentimental, it felt like a responsibility he had inherited the moment he recognized her work. By midday, his assistant had already made discreet phone calls to a handful of contacts. Michael wanted to move quietly, without creating the kind of public spectacle that would embarrass the Carters or turn them into a charity headline. He reached out to a children's arts program he had funded in the past and arranged for Sophie to receive a scholarship for private dance lessons. But not just any lessons, he specifically requested Ava Brooks, a choreographer he trusted, known for her rare ability to teach children to express emotion through movement rather than just perfecting steps. He believed that someone like Ava could give Sophie not only skill but also confidence, the kind that wouldn't depend on her dress, her background, or the approval of her classmates. At the same time, he contacted a clinic specializing in Megan's illness, one with a treatment plan that could be covered entirely through his foundation. He arranged for a home nurse to visit during the most demanding stages of recovery so that Megan could focus on getting better without worrying about who would care for Sophie. For her dignity, he ensured that all of this would be framed not as a personal favor but as a part of a broader community initiative. He understood the pride in Megan's eyes and the way she chose her words carefully to avoid sounding as if she were asking for help. He wanted her to feel supported without feeling indebted. The dress itself remained on his mind. He called a restoration workshop that specialized in preserving garments with personal history, asking them to examine it closely, repair the structural wear, and enhance its character without erasing its past. "I want the holes preserved," he instructed the seamstress over the phone, "but I want them framed with embroidery so they look intentional, part of the story. And the stains, turn them into flowers, but keep the original bird stitches exactly as they are. Those must remain untouched." The seamstress paused, clearly intrigued, before agreeing to take the project. Michael arranged for the dress to be collected discreetly, promising Sophie would have it back in time for the spring performance at her school. He also reached out to the principal, suggesting a new school program he would fund entirely, called Grace's Birdies in honor of his sister. It would provide free music and dance classes, as well as a costume library made from donated and restored clothing, so that no child would feel excluded from